Welcome. We're going to start a new series here, and I typically, when I do these series, I try to edit out all the mistakes I make, all the things I say that I wish I would have said it in a different way, or I stutter over my words, or whatever else it might be. I'm going to try in this video series to just talk through this subject. It's an important subject. It's a subject that means a lot to me. I've learned so much over the past years, the past maybe 5 years on this subject. And it's really had a transforming effect on the way I view the gospel and on the way I view the Christian life, the way I view the church. It's just been that helpful to me. So I want to share it with you. And in sharing it with you, I want to do it in the most natural way that I possibly can. So I've got a cup of coffee here in my coffee mug that says, I think, Mr. on it. And I've got some notes. And I'm just going to go through my notes, and we're going to go through this series. And I'll use my notes each time and just kind of talk through, trying to keep each video to maybe anywhere between 15 and 25 minutes long, so that they're not too long, that there's something that you can listen to on your drive into work, or as you're doing things around the house, and gives you enough to think about, but not so much that it's like going to school again. The subject is covenant theology. And the first thing I want to do is talk about 4 things that I'd like to cover in this first session. The first is, why do this video series? I mean, Ligon Duncan has put together an amazingly good video series on covenant theology. And you can get that at Reformed Theological Seminary on their website. And you can actually take that seminary level course on covenant theology. And I'm certainly not going to be able to do anything that's going to compare with what Ligon Duncan has done. So why do it? The second thing I want to cover is why study covenant theology. So why the video is number 1, but why covenant theology is number 2. And I really do think it's an important subject. So I want to talk a little bit about why I think it's important for us as Christians in the 21st century to study covenant theology. Third, I'm going to try to define covenant theology. And I'm going to look to Ligon Duncan for some help here, because he's one of the few that I've read that tried to come up with a very concise definition of what is covenant theology. There's a lot of books on covenant theology, and there's a lot of books about subjects and how they relate to covenant theology, but just a quick, easy definition of what is covenant theology is hard to find. We're going to try to do that in this video as well. And then lastly, I want to talk about what's next, what's coming in the next session. And it's important that we kind of tip our hat to what that's going to be, because it's a big subject. And you might not think of this subject when it comes to the study of covenant theology. So let's go ahead and start. And let's talk about why this video series. As I mentioned, Ligon Duncan has a wonderful series out there from Reformed Theological Seminary. That series is fairly scholarly. It's used as part of a seminary curriculum. And even though Ligon Duncan is a pastor first, he is teaching seminary students. And so what I want to do is do a video series on covenant theology that's even more accessible than the great and wonderful work that's been done by Ligon. I also want to take more of a pastoral approach, not as a pastor teaching seminary students, but as a pastor teaching a congregation. And so this series on covenant theology really is a gift to Emmanuel Sovereign Grace Fellowship, to the congregation that I am blessed to be a part of and to serve in. And so I really want this to be more of a pastoral approach to covenant theology. And finally, Ligon Duncan's, as great as that series is, Ligon Duncan is a paedobaptist. That means he believes in the baptizing of infants, the infant children of believers. I want to take a track that is specifically what we call credo Baptist, which means the baptism of those who profess faith in Jesus Christ, so the baptism of believers. And I want to show that covenant theology, as it's been understood historically by Reformed theologians and pastors and teachers, that it is at its core credo Baptist. And that's going to be my bent, my argument, to show that as a Baptist, I can believe in and accept covenant theology. So those are the reasons why this video series. Well, let's move on and ask, why study covenant theology? So here, I want to study covenant theology with you because I see three things about covenant theology that I think are central to us as Christians here in the 21st century, have been central to what it means to be a Christian throughout history. Covenant theology is first and foremost God-centered. That means that it is consistent with a biblical understanding of the being and nature of God. That means that it is organically tied to the sovereignty of God and the purposes of God in salvation. So covenant theology is at its core God-centered. Secondly, covenant theology is at its core Christ-centered. Christ is the beginning and the end of all God's activities with his people. All of God's covenantal works in redemption, all of the covenants that he makes in history, all point to, lead to, and culminate in Jesus Christ. So covenant theology is God-centered and covenant theology is Christ-centered. And finally, covenant theology is gospel-centered. Salvation by grace through faith is at the core of covenant theology, and it doesn't matter whether you're talking about a person who was saved all the way back in the time of Enoch, or you're talking about a person who was saved back in the days of Moses after the giving of the law, or you're talking about a person who's saved now as a Christian in the 21st century. It's the same salvation through Christ, by grace, through faith. That same salvation. And covenant theology emphasizes the single way by which you and I can be saved. The same way Moses could be saved, the same way Seth could be saved, the same way Abel could be saved. Covenant theology is God-centered, Christ-centered, gospel-centered, and those three things are so important to us as Christians. All right, let's go ahead now and look at point number 3. What is covenant theology? And I want to spend a little bit of time here, and so I'm going to read to you. I'm going to put it up on the screen so you don't have to watch me as I read, but I'm going to read to you some definitions and some things about what is covenant theology. So let's start with a quote by J.I. Packer. J.I. Packer describes covenant theology like this. He says, "Covenant theology is a way of reading the whole Bible that is itself part of the overall interpretation of the Bible that undergirds it." Now with that, I want to give you 4 points that I think go along with what J.I. Packer is saying and helps us to kind of get our heads around it. Number 1, the Bible is the revelation of the Triune God and his plan to save sinners through Christ. That's what the whole Bible is about. From creation, after creation, the setting up of Adam and Eve in the garden, the covenant of works and the fall of man and the revelation of God's plan to save sinners through Christ, that is the main message and theme of the Bible. And if you remember, covenant theology then is going to pull from that main theme. It's a way of reading the whole Bible. And so therefore, covenant theology is going to be God-centered. It's about the triune God, and it's going to be Christ-centered and his plan to save sinners through Christ, and it's going to be gospel-centered, about God saving sinners by grace through faith. Second, this plan to save is revealed to man by way of covenants. God what's the word I want? God condescends to enter into relationship with man by way of a covenant. He makes covenants. He is the covenant making and the covenant keeping God. And all of his interactions with man, he does so through covenants. And we're going to see that as we get to the third point. Third, covenant theology therefore seeks to understand these covenants, whether so named as covenants by the Bible or not, which is going to be important, and their progressive relations to one another and to God's purpose to save. Let me say that again. Covenant theology seeks to understand these covenants by which God condescends and enters into relationship with man. Covenant theology seeks to understand these covenants, whether so named as covenants or not by the Bible, and their progressive relations to one another and God's purpose to save. Finally, number 4, in doing so, covenant theology is, as J.I. Packer put it, a way of understanding the Bible that comes from the Bible itself. Now, that's the first step, I think, in understanding what is covenant theology. But I want to take it a little bit further, and we're going to look to some help from Ligon Duncan. So let me read to you a definition of covenant theology that Ligon uses in his video series. And I'm going to modify it just slightly. And I know he would agree with this modification, so it's not changing what he thinks about covenant theology. And if you watch his video series, you'll know that. But I'm going to change it just slightly. Here's the definition. Ligon Duncan. Covenant theology is the gospel set in the context of God's eternal plan of communion with his redeemed people and its historical outworking in the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. You can see here the word that I've added, his redeemed people. Now that might seem like a splitting of hairs, for Ligon Duncan's definition says God's eternal plan of communion with his people. But what I hope to show you as we go through this study is that there is a sense in which God took unto himself a people, Israel, of whom all were not redeemed. They were not his elect. They were not his regenerate, believing people. But they were called his people. So I want to make it clear that covenant theology is the gospel set in the context of God's eternal plan of communion with his redeemed people and its historical outworking in 2 covenants, the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. 3 things I think we see here. God and his plan, that's God-centeredness. Christ, that's Christ-centeredness. And the gospel, that's gospel-centeredness. So Ligon's definition of covenant theology is a God-centered, Christ-centered, and gospel-centered definition. The 2 main covenants that we want to talk about when we talk about covenant theology is the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. Now that doesn't mean we're not going to look at the historical covenants that we see in the Bible. The covenant made with Noah, with Abraham, with Moses, with David, and the new covenant that we find in the New Testament. We're going to look at those historical covenants and how they relate to, specifically, the covenant of grace. But the 2 primary covenants that we need to see and understand is the covenant of works and the covenant of grace. Now, lastly, I said our 4th thing, we'd have 4 things. The 4th one is what's next. And what I want you to do is start to think about, when we think about covenant theology, I want you to start to think about the divine decree of God, God's plan to save sinners. That is this eternal plan where he chose us in Christ from before the foundation of the world, that the divine decree is at the heart of covenant theology. As a matter of fact, covenant theology is inherently reformed. Covenant theology is inherently what we might call Calvinistic. It is an understanding of God's plan of salvation, and it is distinctively reformed. If you hold to a reformed understanding of God's sovereignty, then you will find covenant theology to fit very well and right in with what the Bible teaches about God's sovereignty, especially his sovereignty in salvation. So thanks for joining me for this session together, this first introduction to covenant theology. And I look forward to coming back in the second one. We're going to look specifically at the divine decree. We're going to dive into it just a little bit, look at the divine decree, and then start to see at least how that relates to covenant theology. And then we'll go straight on in and look at things like creation and the covenant of works. Thanks for joining me. Till I see you again, bye for now.